Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Open Market Institute's roundtable with the producers of Food Inc. 2 and other experts on the food system. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So to start us off, I'm going to do some introductions, and then we'll jump into questions. Today, we're joined by Eric Schlosser, who's the author of Fast Food Nation. He was co-producer of the first Food Inc. movie and now co-producer for Food Inc. 2, Back for Seconds. Also on our panel is Max Miller. Max is a competition advisor to FTC Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya. He previously enforced antitrust and consumer protection laws for the great agricultural state of Iowa, and he still calls it home. And finally, we have Claire Kellaway, Program Manager for Fair Food and Farming Systems at the Open Market Institute. She's also the lead writer for Food and Power, a website focused on monopoly power in food and agriculture. And so before we have a little bit of a treat, I wanted to just let you all know that we will be taking audience questions at the end of this. So if you want to put those into the YouTube chat, we'd be happy to take a look at those at the end of our discussion. So now we're going to take a look at the trailer for Food Inc. 2 to give you a taste of what's to come.
Over the last 2 decades, something called the food movement got started. But the food industry is dominated by a handful of very powerful companies. So there's a lot at stake when you sit down to eat. When the pandemic hit, the curtain was peeled back. There were whole crops being buried. At the same time, there were shortages in the supermarket.
But that's not the only problem. Working in the fields, our work is essential, but we as people were treated as disposable.
How could I go to work for these billion-dollar companies and feed all these people, all to come home to hear my son's stomach growl?
By fixing our food system, we will create health and well-being in every aspect of our lives.
I want rural America to be vibrant again. That's my motivation here. They're going to say, we're not going to let some big mouth senator from Montana stop us. And so, bring it on, guys.
Every one of our oysters filters 50 gallons of water a day, and our kelp soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants.
This is solar-powered, electrically driven, on a programmable basis.
You're dealing with a crowd that does not like change.
When you walk into a supermarket, there's a whole arsenal of additives designed to mislead the brain, actually interfering with the brain's and the body's ability to metabolize food.
I sure as heck don't want my tax dollars subsidizing the things that are making people sick.
Now, what are the proteins that you're producing?
That's something we can't talk about on camera right now.
I wanted to wake up in the morning believing what I was doing. This is wealth right here.
Programs like ours demonstrate the kind of policy change that we want to see.
This is our chance to chart a new course.
I want to see people living life, not just fighting to survive.
Just imagine if the government decided to step in on the side of the consumer and the citizen.
We not only can do it, we have to.
Okay, so now that we've had a chance to get a sense of the movie, I want to start our discussion with kind of a table setter of a question for Eric, who is deeply involved in shaping the film. Food Inc. 2 really homes in on consolidation in our food systems. We've certainly seen a lot of attention on this issue from the Biden administration. But a lot of our food markets have been consolidated for a long time. So I wanted to ask right now, why the focus on monopoly power in this sequel?
Yeah, well, it's all gotten worse. I started my research for my book, what became my book, Fast Food Nation, in 1997. And in 1997, I was really concerned by how the purchasing power of the fast food chains was really pushing consolidation in the food industry across the United States. And everything has just gotten worse and worse and worse. And it's quite remarkable, particularly, some of the statistics about what's happened in rural America. Since the Reagan administration, we've lost more than half of our cattle ranchers, more than 90% of our dairy farmers, more than 90% of our hog farmers have been driven off the land. And this is one of the most important impacts of this consolidation, because it not only affects those farmers and producers, but it also affects really the character of rural America. So Michael Pollan and I were really shocked when the pandemic revealed a lot of the fragility in our food production system, and it made us dive back into food and see what was going on. And I'm very sad to say that, I've been engaged in this issue for almost 3 decades, and I've just seen it get worse until the Biden administration's renewed emphasis on antitrust, which is welcome. And I think that there's such a strong awareness now of this issue that hopefully there'll be action commensurate with the problem.
So I'm glad you brought up the COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to also talk a little bit about food prices. As consumers know painfully well, food prices are up more than 20% since the start of the pandemic. But the Biden administration and other critics of big agriculture say that it's not just about, supply chain bottlenecks or high costs of fuel or fertilizer, but they're blaming corporate greed. And they say that the money isn't necessarily going to workers in the supply chain or to farmers. So I wanted to kind of start with Claire a little bit and talk about this. Where do we think these higher food prices are going? And should consumers expect any relief soon?
Sure. I mean, so obviously there have been legitimate, external factors that are raising food prices. No denying pandemic has disrupted supply chains, increased fuel prices. But, when we look economy-wide, corporate profits are contributing to increased food prices in a way that we have not seen over the past 40 years. Starting from 2020 to about late 2023, corporate profits have been responsible for over half of the increase in prices economy-wide, compared to historically just 11% is how much corporate profits typically contributed to these kind of price increases. And so where is the money going? I feel like in the beginning of, food price inflation, there was a lot of focus on the fact that fast food workers, meat processing plant workers were actually seeing long overdue wage increases. But even there, the amount that wages have contributed to price increases is actually historically low. Generally, wage increases have contributed to 60% or more of overall price increases, but during the pandemic, they only contributed to about 8% of price increases. And so, in fact, the, frankly, long overdue wage increases that workers saw have now been largely eclipsed, by these price increases. And yeah, I just think you look at the concentration in the supply chain, and we see that corporations can raise prices simply because they can. And I think you do see some critics say, as to the point of what Eric just spoke about, our food supply chains have been consolidated for a long time. So why now? It can't just be in this moment that, companies are all of a sudden getting greedy. But what we see is that companies can collude and coordinate their behavior in different ways at different times. So in the aftermath of the recession, they were primarily coordinating to lower wages and increase their profits that way. And then now, we see they have kind of the cover of overall price increases. And, in concert, a lot of these companies are raising their prices.
So just jumping off of that, I wanted to ask Max a little bit about kind of what the FTC is seeing. I know in the last, I think it was the last couple of months, the FTC put out a report about the grocery retail sector during the pandemic and what they kind of observed in this study. So, I mean, could you kind of respond to the question about food prices, Max, and tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and what your takeaways are?
So thank you so much for having me. And I first just want to explain, Marcia, that, I'm here in my personal capacity. I can't really speak for the FTC or for Commissioner Bedoya, who I work for. but can speak to my own kind of personal opinions and personal experiences. And I think when you think about this change of approach, Eric noted kind of the change of approach that has come. So much of it is motivated by seeing how corporate concentration has affected people in the market. And you're not just talking about labor, you're not just talking about consumers, you're talking about other market participants, producers, small businesses, people that contribute to the economy in very different ways. And one thing that, I'm very proud to work for Commissioner Bedoya, because he has been out there in the country talking to people, talking to farmers, talking to people in the food supply chain, talking to grocers, to pharmacists. All of these are part of the ecosystem. And when we see the impacts of corporate concentration on all these different parts of the economy, that of course motivates, agencies, government overall to act and try to fix the problems. Now, I will note that, of course, everything that the government tries to do is often met with resistance by interested parties who do not want to see change happen and do not want to see the reform happen. And so that means that it can take some time before we actually see the impacts of the government's effort to actually, change the market and lead to better results for Americans. But that, doesn't mean that we're not going to stop, or we're not going to try to fix it in the meantime.
So I want to ask Eric a little bit about how this shaped your thinking about the movie. I know you focused a little bit on several industries in the movie. When you were looking into those and doing some research, what were some things that stood out to you during the pandemic? I mean, was it meatpacking? Was it berries? Was it, grains? What did you see, and what did you want to bring out in the movie in terms of industries that were especially consolidated or struggled during the pandemic?
Well, what led me to write about food again during the pandemic was watching how America's meatpacking workers were being sacrificed to keep production going. And my book, Fast Food Nation, was really structured so that, it led you into the slaughterhouse. It wasn't an original idea. It was Upton Sinclair who used the slaughterhouse as a metaphor for the monopoly capitalism of his day. And my book, Fast Food Nation, really tried to do the same thing for meatpacking workers, immigrant workers being exploited, ground up literally in the machinery and then fired. And it was outrageous to me seeing how not only the meatpacking industry was putting the desire for continued production over the health and safety of its workers, but how complicit the Trump administration was. It was extraordinary to have this executive order issued under the Defense Production Act that basically said that local health departments shouldn't shut down meatpacking plants because continued access to meat was in the national security. And it just so happened that one of the plants that I had spent time in and around while researching my book was in Greeley, Colorado, and it was the Colorado Health Department, the Weld County Health Department, that tried to shut down that plant that led to Trump issuing his executive order. I didn't know at the time when I wrote this piece for The Atlantic that the executive order first draft was literally written by Tyson Foods. And to me, it was just a perfect example of how the government that's supposed to be protecting the public health and the public interests had been completely captured by private interests. So, and I'll wrap up very quickly. My entry into the food system in the early 90s was following the harvest with migrant farm workers in California. And I care about all these issues that we're talking about in our food system, but I ultimately care most about the labor issues and about how the people who feed us are being so brutally exploited and demonized in the case of immigrants.
So we've talked a little bit about the problem that the movie highlights and that a lot of folks are working on. And now I want to move to talking a little bit about what the government is doing, what the government can do, what are the existing tools that exist. So just to start us off, I'll just briefly say that the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission recently revised the merger guidelines, which is an initiative that folks expect will bring more scrutiny to more deals, and essentially more scrutiny on consolidation in markets more broadly. So I want to ask Max, how do you see this change impacting the environment for deals? What do you think it will mean for big companies that might be trying to buy up their smaller rivals? And then, moving forward beyond that, what are some other tools at the government's disposal to get at this issue?
Thank you so much, Marcia. I'm happy to answer that. So first, I just want to table set and explain that the merger guidelines are really the agencies explaining to the market how the agencies are going to review mergers. And one of the things I think about this revision to the merger guidelines that has been so important, in prior iterations of the merger guidelines, it has been highly technical. I'll be honest, antitrust law is a very technical field. It requires lots of study, lots of understanding, not just of kind of the principles of fairness and maybe what motivated the laws originally, but also in kind of modern economics and how much economic thinking has changed over time and trying to apply that to the work. But the thing that I think that this merger guidelines did that was so important is to make it very digestible for the average American. Right. So it's not just the companies who are considering a merger and thinking about how the agencies will review it and whether or not the agencies will decide to block it, but also so that Americans can see how their government is thinking about mergers. And I do think it's important to note that merger review of the agencies. That's only one part of the antitrust tools that are available to the agencies. That comes from Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which allows the government to potentially stop mergers that are anti-competitive. And all of the antitrust laws came about after what I would say was a very similar time in American history, which was called the Gilded Age. And it was a time when capital kind of concentrated into a few Americans' hands. It hurt the productivity of the country because, that concentration of power and capital. And so that motivated the passage of the Sherman Act in 1890. And the Sherman Act basically provided, two types of conduct that it would go after. One is what's called collusion, companies working together to actually manipulate the market for their benefit as opposed to the public's benefit. And then Section 2, which prevents monopolization. And so Section 2, as it's been applied, is you're talking about a big company that is engaging in conduct that actually hurts competition, that prevents competition from happening in the market. But after about 20 years of application of the Sherman Act, and what had happened was the courts actually kind of weakened what Congress intended with the Sherman Act. They passed the Clayton Act, and they passed the FTC Act, which created the agency of the Federal Trade Commission. And the Clayton Act provides very specific types of conduct that the agencies will consider to be in violation of the law. This is things like overlapping directorships. The Robinson-Patman Act is actually an amendment to an earlier part of the Clayton Act, Section 2. But I want to talk about the FTC Act because it's one of the more useful tools that the government has. Because in addition to the way that courts, interpret the Sherman Act, there's this much broader provision that Congress gave to the FTC, which is unfair methods of competition, which was intended by Congress to capture the types of conduct that wouldn't necessarily fall into the statutory construct of the Sherman Act. I do want to mention the Robinson-Patman Act just because I believe it is so important when we're talking about food supply chains. The Robinson-Patman Act requires that any supplier, right? So a company that is providing products to say like a grocery, market or to a grocery store or a small store or whatever, they need to provide, not equal pricing, but the idea is that they're not allowed to engage in discrimination in pricing. So what Congress provided was a way to go after companies that are providing sweetheart deals to certain companies in the market, right? Like say that it's a large buyer. You can think of like a large retail store that might be getting a special deal with the supplier, right? And that is not based upon efficiencies. Congress understood that, hey, there's benefits to economies of scale, there's benefits to efficiency. But if you're engaged in discrimination, where you are providing that deal just simply because that company is larger rather than being more efficient, well, then that's a violation of law that the FTC and private plaintiffs should be interested in enforcing. So I think that gives a little bit of an overview of the different tools that are available. Certainly, courts have had their say in how much these can be used. But that's why it does. First, it takes enforcers that are willing to use those tools, to start to make change happen in the market.
Yeah, that's a really helpful overview, Max. So, Claire, I want to move to you and hear a little bit about kind of from your perspective as an advocate. You've pressed the government to be more active in enforcing these laws, reviving enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act, which, as we know, wasn't really enforced for the last 40 years or so. And so I guess I was just wondering, could you speak to how this change in the merger guidelines, you expect that to impact some of the, deals you're watching in the grocery or food sectors, and maybe some of the other tools that Max just mentioned, and how you might see those impacting the food markets?
Absolutely. So I guess starting with the merger guidelines, I think, there are a lot of ways that they've changed. Some of the, I guess, three ones that stand out for me in terms of affecting food systems is just one, a more stricter presumption against companies that are merging to control more than 30% of the market. We see companies all over the food system approaching that threshold. And so having that in a more strict sense is really going to affect the decisions to merge. I also think a big issue in the food system is vertical integration. So you have a dominant, for instance, chemical company buying up a bunch of seed genetics to then become a dominant seed company. They're not necessarily buying up their fellow, well, they are. They're also buying up their fellow chemical companies, but they're transferring their dominance in one area into another through vertical integration. And these new guidelines take a stricter stance against those kind of deals. But then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, so many of the harms of large, food processors, large food buyers is felt on farmers and workers who have fewer places to sell their goods or fewer, places to work. And where previous merger guidelines were really focused on consumers, the new guidelines look at also this idea of, it's called monopsony power, so buyer power, and how mergers are going to affect, people selling their wares. And that's huge in the food system. And I think one example of that, it actually looked at both ends, is the FTC recently sued to block the Kroger-Albertsons merger. We've seen a long track record of pretty permissive approach to grocery mergers by the FTC. Most mergers have been approved conditional on sell-offs, selling off stores that were competing head to head, and the idea it can maintain competition. But this merger really, or this enforcement against this merger really rejects that approach. And looks not just at how this deal would have raised prices for consumers, which it would have, severely decreased head-to-head competition for consumers, but it also severely decreases competition for specifically unionized workers. Kroger and Albertsons are two of the biggest employers for the United Food and Commercial Workers, and the case considered labor markets to be a legitimate area of decreased competition, and has a whole theory of how this merger would harm workers specifically. And that's really a novel approach, and a really meaningful one that, will have effects not just for grocery workers, but also, other mergers that affect labor markets.
So, Max, I want to follow up on something you said earlier. Obviously this doesn't really reflect on Kroger or Albertsons. These are two really major grocery chains seeking to merge. But, we talked a little bit about maverick competitors, this idea of smaller competitors. I was wondering if you could explain to us kind of what that means when we're talking about like a big company, there's a small kind of upstart competitor, and that company wants to buy their smaller rival. And, how will the merger guidelines change, for example, how the FTC or the DOJ might look at that? I know you can't speak exactly to what the FTC would do, but from a broad perspective.
Right. Well, so first off, the idea of maverick competitors is something that has been in prior iterations of the merger guidelines. It's just, I think a lot of it just comes down to the will. right? Like, is that something that you're willing to focus on, like in merger review? But just to explain what a maverick competitor is, and I apologize if I go off on a tangent here. There's just kind of so much that's related to this. Part of what happened to merger review and to antitrust law since like the early 1980s is kind of changing like what we consider to be important for consideration of whether or not competition is happening. And a lot of that has become a reliance on economic modeling. I think for anybody that starts to really dig into economics, you start to understand that so much of it is based upon assumptions. It's based upon kind of ideas of how markets work that aren't necessarily tied to reality. But one of the things that I've always appreciated about even prior iterations of the merger guideline is this focus on a maverick competitor. Because while the economic model might tell you that a large competitor buying up a smaller competitor doesn't really change the structure of the market that much, I personally believe that that small competitor can be providing a lot of competitive forces on the larger the competitor that maybe the economic models aren't able to pick up. And it might be that they're looking at a particular segment of the consumer market that they're appealing to, a segment that the larger competitor is having trouble, capturing. And so they want to acquire them so they can capture that consumer market. But to take it back a little bit to, I think, related to kind of concepts of maverick competitors and how we do merger analysis, because I do want to be clear, like, I think mergers, it's just one tool of antitrust. And when you're talking about already concentrated markets, it's hard to unring the bell, right? It's hard. And we certainly have found in antitrust enforcement that it's very hard to break companies up. It's only happened a couple of times in American history that the antitrust laws have been used to take a big company and break it up into smaller companies. So that's why I think when we're talking about structurally changing markets or really kind of making outcomes better for small businesses, for consumers, for producers in the market, the conduct regime of antitrust, focusing on monopolization and Section 2 and how it can be used, focusing on the Robinson-Patman Act, for instance, which, Congress was very clear. There's this mantra among a particular part of the antitrust bar that antitrust is about protecting consumers and not competitors. Well, that's just false. That's not what Congress ever thought. Congress, in considering the antitrust laws, actually made it very explicitly clear that antitrust was to be used as well as protecting consumers and providing lower prices to consumers, to making sure that small competitors in the market have a level playing field, have fairness with which to compete in the market. Mm-hmm. I think you're on mute.
I am muted. I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of the relationship between consolidation and access to food and access to healthy food. The movie certainly touches on these themes. Eric has already talked to us a little bit about consolidation and the impact of labor on labor. And Claire has mentioned monopsony power, which can also be considered when you think about, like, are there multiple employers where I can try to get a job? So, I want to ask Eric, when you were making this movie, what were some of the impacts you noticed in, for example, the beef market or maybe in grains on sort of how consumers, what types of foods they were able to access, whether they were able to get healthy food, and how kind of consolidation was shaping some of their food choices?
Yeah. Well, one obvious way that consolidation affects whether food is healthy or not is the centralization and industrialization, particularly in the meat industry, provides all kinds of new access points for dangerous pathogens. If you went back in time to the 1950s and 1960s, when ground beef would come from small processing plants or even from butcher shops, you would have a relatively small outbreak if some of that meat was contaminated. When you then have enormous consolidation and centralization in meatpacking, and you have perhaps 14 beef slaughterhouses producing most of the beef that people eat, if there's a problem, the problem becomes a nationwide problem, not a local problem. And we're seeing that right now with the possibility of avian influenza being spread through our dairies. I mean, we used to have the typical herd size at an American dairy was 75 cows, 150 cows a dairy farmer might have. we now have mega dairies that are 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 cows. And it's remarkable how little we know right now about how widespread this avian influenza is in America's dairy herds, because the federal government literally lacks the power to go into these mega dairies and start testing not only the animals, but the workers. So, food safety would be a problem that consolidation has brought. But also, I think this emphasis on ultra-processed food is part of the centralization and industrialization of our food system. I mean, when you're not relying on local bakeries, on local, food shops, you have these companies that are not only selling their foods nationally, but internationally now. And there's an added profit motive in having the value added from processing and ultra processing. There's storage advantages, there's uniformity advantages, but what's more profitable for the company certainly isn't necessarily profitable for society as a whole. So we're now seeing all these external costs being imposed on society, and what's profitable for these companies, as I said, isn't profitable for America if taxpayers are having to pay for the obesity epidemic, for perhaps some of the cancers and huge healthcare costs that come from consuming this ultra-processed food.
I've certainly been covering the impact of bird flu in dairy herds across the country, and I hope it will go away, but it's not looking promising right now. But I want to kind of follow up a little bit on something we were talking about earlier too. We talked about enforcement tools, but the federal government can also issue rulemakings. And I know that the Department of Agriculture is trying to strengthen their own antitrust authority under what's known as the Packers and Stockyards Act. So I want to ask Claire a little bit about what she thinks of those rulemakings and how they're kind of getting at this issue of consolidation, especially in the meat sector.
Definitely. So I think Max touched on earlier, right? Like it can be hard to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, when you have so much consolidation that's happened. I obviously do still think that there is enough evidence for antitrust investigators to take a serious look at these consolidated meat companies and see if they have become too large and that a breakup is really the main solution here. At the same time, we have this huge toolkit, the Packers and Stockyards Act, that's designed to be almost like a mini FTC Act specifically for the meat industry to ensure that meat packers are treating farmers fairly, are not engaging in deceptive practices, are engaging in basic, cheating, underpaying, paying farmers on time. But it also looks at their marketing tactics. So are they engaging in exclusive dealing and kickback schemes with big buyers to say, buy all of your meat from me, and if so, we'll give you a chunk back so that you're not buying from our competitors. And the USDA has been issuing some new rules under the Packers and Stockyards Act, most of them focused on meat packers' relationship with farmers. And even then, most of them have been focused specifically on chicken farmers, because chicken farmers are in a pretty abusive relationship with meat packers. A chicken farmer isn't just raising chickens and selling them to a packer. A chicken company is providing those farmers with their feed, with their chickens, with their animal care. And a chicken grower is, for the most part, investing at sometimes, over $1 million in chicken barns, and then just, raising chickens for the company in the hopes of paying off that debt. Obviously, that relationship exposes farmers to a ton of different ways that they can never get out of that cycle of debt. And so USDA has issued some new rules to ensure those contracts have minimum pay guarantees. It's very transparent, that some of these requirements to invest in new facilities are justified, and explain, how you're going to get a return on this. A bunch of different things so that farmers, before entering into these contracts, can actually get a sense of, am I going to be trapped here? And so, yeah, this is a whole area where you can mitigate and put guardrails on some of the biggest abuses of market power that these companies have. I would think what's been done so far is just a start, and there's still a lot of other things that can be done, both under the Packers and Stockyards Act, but also at other antitrust agencies.
And it's also maybe worth saying that it's certainly not chicken that is the only livestock raised on contract. We're seeing that more and more in pork as well. But I do want to move on to another tool that the government has, which is frankly money. So the Biden administration, they have kind of huge amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money, especially coming out of the Department of Agriculture. This is mainly coming through laws such as the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the American Rescue Plan, and that includes over $1 billion for independent meat processing plants. So when I talk to farmers, especially small and mid-sized producers, a lot of the problems that they bring up is that, they can't get any space in a Tyson plant, for example, because their scale is so much bigger that Tyson doesn't really have time to process 30 animals. So this is a way that the Biden administration is trying to build up local and regional processing. So I wanted to ask our panelists, how are you starting to see that play out on the ground? And is it making a difference yet? Maybe, I don't know if Claire wants to jump in on that. I know you've been following this closely.
Yeah, I can start. I think so, but yeah, when you have an industry that's controlled, when the top four companies control anywhere from 50 to 80% of processing, as we see in the meatpacking industry, it's really hard for these new plants and new competitors to convince a bank to give them money, right? Because it's really hard to break in. And so, to Eric's point about how much, these meat companies really just completely broke down and harmed workers in the whole food supply chain during the pandemic, it's really clear that this is, important infrastructure that needs to be made more resilient. And so a public investment in that case definitely makes sense. At the same time, almost to what I was talking about with the Packers and Stockyards Act and the way that these meatpacking companies still use a bunch of really abusive and exclusionary exercises of market power, it is going to be extremely challenging for these new plants to find access to markets and to break into this competitive or this non-competitive market. So it is still pretty early in terms of the money going out to meatpacking plants. We certainly haven't seen any we haven't seen a bunch of them haven't even gotten started yet. But it's gonna take some time, and I do think I'm gonna be looking to see what antitrust regulators are doing on the marketing side to again level the playing field in terms of that question of access to market. Like you have a plant, but who are you going to sell to? Why is it so challenging for your local processing plant to actually end up in your local grocery store? And how do you break down some of the barriers there?
And I just want to add that, Max talked about the difficulty and the rarity of breaking up large corporations. The meatpacking industry is a test case of that not only being done, but done very successfully. When Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle in 1906, there was something called the Beef Trust. The Beef Trust actually controlled a smaller proportion of the market for beef than the top 3, 4 meatpacking companies do today. But it was successful in the sense that by the 1970s, the top 4 companies in the United States controlled about 23% of the market. It was a competitive market for beef. Wages in the meatpacking industry were remarkably higher than they are today. There were waiting lists for jobs at meatpacking plants, and you can just use the beef industry as a test case of the harms of monopoly. From the 1980s onward, it became more and more concentrated. Wages were cut significantly, unions were broken, and as I mentioned about the number of ranchers being driven off the land, you need competition not only in the supermarket, but you need competition in spot markets for all of these commodities. It's basically there is no real market for hogs anymore, and that's happened in just the last 30 years. There is no real competitive market for poultry. Both of those commodities are being produced mainly under contract to these big meatpacking companies. So you ultimately have to think about, well, what sort of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a society in which there's real competition, in which there aren't huge barriers to entry, which, were just being mentioned about these new slaughterhouses that we want to have? Or do you want to live in a command economy? And we've seen what happens in command economies like the old Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. They're remarkably inefficient and destructive environmentally. And in this case, we have a command economy which is funneling the profits to a very small handful of people in this country. And I'll just end by noting, the other thing that's coincided with this rise of consolidation and oligopoly and monopoly power is the federal minimum wage today, adjusted for inflation, is 50% lower than it was in the late 1960s. And what that means in real terms is the poorest workers in the United States have gotten a 50% pay cut. So, we're talking about separate issues, and yet they're all interrelated. What's happening to producers, what's happening to workers, and the ways in which these companies are allowed through their market power to externalize their business costs, whether it's food safety issues, the incredible environmental contamination that comes from factory farms, or just the incredible cruelty, the animal cruelty that has been introduced in the last 30 to 40 years by having, 10,000, 20,000 cows, or thousands of hogs in these concentrated facilities.
So, go ahead, Max.
May I jump in? Yeah, there's just been a lot of great discussion happening here the last few minutes, and I just want to jump in. I think both of what Claire is talking about and sorry, I think I put myself on mute there. What both of them are talking about is essentially what I would call trade-offs in adopting efficiency as the paramount philosophy, as the paramount guiding light for government policy. Right? Because I think when we talk about efficiency, we always should ask, efficient for whom? Right? How is it that the efficiencies that are created by whatever conduct we're talking about in the market, whatever policy that we're talking about, who does it benefit and who does it hurt? Because there are trade-offs in everything that's done. And this is one of my critiques of the adoption of economics as the sole kind of guiding principles of antitrust. Because when Congress was considering all of these laws, right, considering about how they wanted the markets to be structured in America, they considered far more than efficiency. Efficiency was part of their analysis. They thought about it, right? But they understood that when you adopt efficiency above all else, there are huge trade-offs to our society. And I recently was having a conversation with an economist that I thought was interesting because I believe that one of the most important aspects for making capitalism work is consumer choice. Consumers having multiple ways to get what they want, right? And then choosing. That's what Adam Smith talked about when he talked about wealth of nations and the power of capitalism. He spoke very specifically about the importance of having competitors in the market in order to create consumer choice. That was that consumers could vote with their dollar in order to make the economy function in the way they wanted to. And so when we talk about antitrust policy and kind of its impact on society, we need to remember that if we put efficiency above everything else, there will be huge trade-offs that come from that. And I wanted to note one. I've got a book that I always keep close to me, which is by Arthur Oken, and it was written in the 1970s. It was put out by the Brookings Institute, and it was called Equality and Efficiency, the Big Trade-Off. And even though I disagree with some of the conclusions that Oken comes to, I think he did a really good job in kind of talking about when we structure our policy in our society, right? We kind of have these two guiding principles. Do we want to have an efficient society, which, I'm sorry, or not sorry, Eric, you mentioned command economies such as the Soviet Union. Part of their idea was that, hey, the government can efficiently produce all of this, for the benefit of society, right? So anyway, at the FTC, and I will say that specifically at Commissioner Bedoya's office, we've spoken a lot about the ideas of fairness in markets. And I think when we discuss in the food supply chain system, we're talking about these two competing ideas. Do we want to have an efficient, supply chain market, or do we want to have a fair supply chain market? And there are benefits that come from a fair system that we should never ignore when talking about what the best policy is to have.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in for a second. I think one of the main problems has been the measure of efficiency that we've been using for the last 40 years. It's been an extremely narrow measure of efficiency because, if you internalize these business costs, you wind up with a very different sort of economic structure. And these companies, like, the polluters of the 1950s and 60s, before we had environmental laws, have just been able to impose their harms on the rest of society. And there's this new movement called true cost accounting, which is to trying to get a real measure of efficiency. I mean, the Rockefeller Foundation did a study of our food system a couple of years ago, which showed that, if you just use the traditional measure of how big is the food system in the American economy, the number that they come up with is $1 trillion roughly. But then if you look at all the other external costs of the food system, it comes out to about $3 trillion, whether it's the pollution, whether it's the healthcare costs that come from this ultra-processed food, whether it's the social costs of food workers whose, healthcare, et cetera, is picked up by taxpayers. So the system that we have right now that is justified on the basis of efficiency is remarkably inefficient. So even if you stick to an economic measure of how it's doing, you can change what the parameters are and come up with a far more efficient system if you just include all these other things that are being reduced from the, cut out of the model.
So before we jump to our next question, I want to just remind our audience that we are accepting questions from the audience. So if you can just put that in the YouTube chat, and we will take a look at those and try to get to those before the end of the hour. But just moving on to the next question, I just want to really quickly put a bow on this question about the money that USDA is spending. And I want to ask, what happens when the money dries up? We don't know what's going to happen in November. We also don't know that there will be, for example, another crisis that enables the passage of these huge pieces of legislation. So, I mean, how should consumers think about that? And how should, and what can enforcers do, for example, when, all that $1 billion for meat packing and regional processing plants is gone, is spent? I don't know. Sorry, I guess maybe Max could jump in on this, or Claire. I know you guys have all kind of thought about this.
Well, I would just kind of point out, and this, once again, this personal opinion, this is not a position of the FTC or Commissioner Bedoya, that in general, government supports to small competitors can be very important for maintaining competition, right? But it can't be relied upon. It can be, maybe in a concentrated market, it can make sense to ensure that there's some startup competitors, to ensure that there's alternative ways that products can reach market, whether it be through distribution or through processing. That I always like to think about when you think about what the USDA is doing, right? They're creating small processing competitors, which allows small retail groceries, right, to do business with those small, the small processors. And then for small family farms that are producing, cattle or pork or chickens, that they can go through those small it's just an alternative way for food to reach the market. And that's generally a good thing. But it's more about having long-term strategies for protecting competition in the market. And that's where we need to have strong laws. We need to think about how we are enforcing the laws, thinking about the principles that guide us in enforcing the law to ensure that actual competition and that real competitors exist in the market, and that we don't just allow this consolidation in the name of, something such as quote unquote superior efficiency.
I'll just add that the fact that this could be a once in a generation investment makes it all the more important that these firms aren't bought up by the dominant competitors down the line. And so that, comes back to the importance of merger policy and the discussion of maverick firms and all of that. And then similarly, that they have a fair playing field for succeeding and competing on the merits. And, that's when we're looking at things like exclusive dealing, and deceptive or abusive marketing tactics. So on both ends, good merger policy and then kind of fair market policy is going to be really important to give this really rare, investment a shot of actually growing and changing the field.
So for this next question, I want to start with Eric, and maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of what the film especially speaks to on this issue. We've talked a lot about both the money that the Biden administration is spending and also the way Biden enforcement agencies are changing kind of how they're enforcing antitrust laws, whether it's Robinson-Patman or Packers and Stockyards, Clayton Act. We've talked about all of these different tools in the toolbox. But, one of the things that is a challenge in antitrust law is that it can take time for the lawsuits to resolve it themselves. And even if the government does win a case, it might not bring about the positive change that proponents are hoping for. So, where does Food Inc. 2 leave consumers, farmers, workers? Where does it advise kind of all of us in the food system to expect in the interim, like as this enforcement is kind of cranking up and as this money is coming out, but it's not necessarily all done yet?
Yeah. Well, the film, doesn't provide solutions to everything in any way. I think that my hope with the film is just to revive interest in the subject matter and catalyze people to getting engaged. And I don't think, and this is something that I felt even when I was writing Fast Food Nation, is I really don't think that this system can be changed through consumer action. I think consumer boycotts can be useful. I think directing spending to companies that are doing things in an ethical way is useful. But ultimately, the change is going to happen through us acting as citizens, getting involved in the political process. And the challenges are enormous. And the challenges are enormous because not only do you have corporations being regarded as people and therefore under the law able to donate and put huge sums of money into the political system to get the outcomes they want, and hiring former government officials, another form of corruption. But you also have to look at the Supreme Court that we have right now and how judges have been ruling for the last 30 to 40 years. It's going to be a real battle. But I take consolation in the fact that my background academically is history. We had so many of these same problems, as Max noted, in the late 19th century. We dealt with them. And to a remarkable degree, we resolved so many of these problems. And it's just going to take a long-term commitment to democracy and freedom and competition to unwind all the problems that have been created in the last 40 years. I mean, we look at the Supreme Court today, and it's just deja vu. I mean, the Supreme Court of the late 19th century and the early 20th century struck down laws that were trying to prohibit child labor. They struck down laws that were trying to impose an 8-hour workday. And, it's very easy for not only the government, but the courts to be captured by these powerful economic interests. But ultimately, I have faith that the power of the 300 million plus Americans is going to outweigh the power of a half dozen or a dozen corporations ultimately. But it's going to take awareness and organization and involvement in all kinds of different forms. So that's what the film was really intended to do, not to provide answers to all the questions, but just to try to energize people and inform people to get engaged in this battle.
Another quick reminder, we are taking questions. We've got a couple in the chat, and we'd love to take more. Claire, can you maybe add to what Eric was saying just now? I know you wanted to add some additional context.
Yeah, I guess if I could jump into Eric's point about how important it is as something to do in the interim just to learn more about this issue, to follow, just understanding how the food system works is so powerful and exposing kind of the clear truth of the harms of consolidation. And so we do have a link tree that I think has been showing at the lower third, the bottom of the screen, where you can find more information about food system consolidation. You can subscribe to my newsletter, Food and Power, if you want to get more regular updates and also learn more about some of these like actions that agencies can take that we've been talking about at FTC, DOJ, USDA, just to get more of the details. So shameless plug for anyone who's feeling inspired and wants to learn more.
Great. So I'm going to jump to a couple audience questions now. The first one we have is from Ed Maltby. He asks, the Capper-Volstead Act protects large dairy cooperatives that have effective monopoly power. And he asks, is it time to reform that act? I don't know if Claire wants to jump in on that one.
Yeah, this is something a couple of years ago, the Open Markets Institute actually put out a report on cooperatives and how to make cooperatives more democratic, looking specifically at this question of their antitrust exemption, given that in the dairy industry, specifically thinking of one of the biggest co-ops, the Dairy Farmers of America, we've seen co-op members suing their own co-op that they ostensibly own for colluding with processors to lower prices paid to farmers. And so what does this all mean, for their antitrust exemption? I think that a key part of the Capper-Volstead Act and cooperatives in general is that cooperatives need to provide a benefit to their members. And so looking at better defining that, like what it actually means to provide a benefit to their members could be one way to advance the law, whether you actually need to change like legislatively or just have more enforcement or directives. There's also this really underused part. The USDA has some authority to intervene when a cooperative is abusing its market power and acting monopolistically. So that is a muscle the USDA has not used in a long, long time and could be another way to look at that law.
Great. So another audience question we have, this one is from Dennis Olson. Olson writes, poultry growers are arguably not independent farmers, but workers if they fall under the ag worker exemption. And he asks, is there any hope that the exemption could be removed and allow growers to organize unions? I don't know if maybe Max wants to jump in on that.
I'm sorry, but I think I don't quite understand that question.
I can jump.
Okay, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, no, not to answer all the questions, but there is a lawsuit right now that argues that poultry growers are misclassified as independent contractors when in fact, by all intents and purposes, their hours they work, what they can do, they kind of meet the definition of a worker in terms of the choice set that they actually have, is what one of these lawsuits is arguing. So I think that's really interesting. I think at the core of that question is this big picture of what antitrust calls vertical restraints, but in all practical purposes is when a company is closely controlling an ostensibly independent business to the point that they're not actually independent. This is what Amazon does with its delivery drivers. All the Amazon trucks you see in your neighborhood are actually not Amazon employees. They're technically third-party independent contractors who don't have the benefit of a minimum wage, who don't have the benefit of all of the legal protections that come from the status of being an employee. Another term that people use is called the fissured workplace. People that, should otherwise be employees because they're controlled like employees by a company have to bear all the liabilities and responsibilities of being an independent business. So this is a much bigger question that doesn't affect just contract poultry growers, but also a ton of quote unquote independent contractors across the economy. There is an interesting antitrust angle to this.
I'd like to, if I could jump in,
Yeah.
Claire. So Commissioner Bedoya has actually written on this, and we are working on an article that is actually going to be coming out in the future here. But he gave a speech recently that's about worker misclassification as potentially a violation of unfair methods of competition under Section 5. And if I could just point out some of these questions, I think kind of go to that's coming from the audience is like, what can we do, or what, like, how can we kind of change things to make it better? And I just would like to make the point that I think Americans forget that antitrust law belongs to them. It's a democratic law at the end of the day. The people get to say what antitrust law is. One of the problems that we have in the policy is that it was usurped by the, instead of it belonging to the people and to Congress to define exactly what antitrust law is, it's kind of been redefined by interested parties in the market. And that's been done through the court system. It's been done through lobbying. It's been done through all sorts of avenues in order to change the way that antitrust law functions. But at the end of the day, it belongs to the people. And one of the things that people should remember is the Sherman Act came about because of organizing. There's a movement that was called the Granger movement, which was farmers in the late 19th century who got together and they said, hey, we are not going to vote for any politician who doesn't actually support competitive markets and doesn't support small businesses in the market and doesn't make sure that our economy functions for the benefit of everyone. And you know what? That worked. Because they did that, politicians had to kind of change their position because they're like, we need all those votes, right? And so they were able to overcome the power of corporations in their, in that time, in the late 19th century, and get the Sherman Act passed, get reforms passed through the early 20th century and how markets function, get the Clayton Act passed, the FTC Act passed, get, food, health, and safety laws passed. And so I just wanted to leave you all with that the law belongs to you, the people, and it takes you being active and paying attention to what is happening in order to make sure the law is enforced in a way that benefits you.
And that seems like a great note to wrap up on, Max. Thank you for that. I just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Claire. And thank you to our audience for joining us, for asking questions. Watch the movie.